The dust of forward operating base Kestrel settled on everything, a fine, khaki-colored film that coated rifle barrels, flak jackets, and the rims of coffee cups. It was a place of waiting, a concrete and razor-wire island in a sea of arid plains, where the heat baked the very air you breathed. Into this simmering pot of boredom and testosterone walked Sergeant Major Elena Petrova. She was a woman of 50, with lines around her eyes that spoke more of sun and focus than of laughter. Her uniform, the Army's mottled green and tan, was an immediate offense to the sea of Marine Corps Marpat digital camouflage that dominated the FOB. She carried a single duffel bag, her movements economical as she stepped out of the dusty transport vehicle. Her posture was straight, but not the rigid, chest-out form of a drill instructor. It was the balanced, centered posture of someone who had spent a lifetime controlling their own space. Captain Marcus Hayes, commander of the fast platoon, met her at the edge of the motor pool. He was young, with the sharp jaw and confident eyes of a man fast-tracked for command. Beside him stood Staff Sergeant Rico Cortez, the platoon sergeant. Cortez was a bulldog of a man, neck as thick as a tree trunk, his arms a roadmap of veins and tattoos earned in gyms and fighting pits from Camp Lejeune to Okinawa. "Sergeant Major Petrova?" Hayes asked, his tone clipped, barely concealing his skepticism. He glanced at the transfer orders in his hand again, as if hoping the words had changed. "Captain Hayes, this is Staff Sergeant Cortez." Petrova met his gaze, her own eyes a cool, steady gray. She gave a short, precise nod. "Captain, Staff Sergeant." Cortez just grunted, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. The assessment was swift and dismissive. He saw the rank, a sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank, but he also saw a woman who looked more like a librarian than a warrior. He saw Army, not Marine. He saw a name, Petrova. That sounded foreign and out of place. He saw a problem. "We weren't expecting you," Hayes said, searching for a diplomatic word and failing. The billet was for a senior enlisted advisor. "From SOCOM. My last assignment was with the Joint Special Operations Logistics Command," Petrova stated, her voice even, without inflection. It was a simple statement of fact. Cortez's lip curled into a barely there smirk. "Logistics, pencil pusher, a glorified quartermaster." He exchanged a look with Hayes, a silent confirmation of their shared disbelief. They had been promised a seasoned operator to refine their tactics, someone from Delta or the Ranger Regiment. They got a supply clerk with graying hair. "Right. Logistics," Hayes said, folding the papers. "Well, Sergeant Major, welcome to Kestrel. Cortez will get you billeted and squared away. Platoon PT is at 0500. We're in the middle of a pre-deployment workup. McMap training in the morning, followed by CQB drills in the shoot house." "I'll be there," Petrova said. Cortez gestured with his chin. "This way, Sergeant Major." The title was laced with just enough sarcasm to be an insult. He led her toward a small, prefabricated hut at the far end of the enlisted quarters, away from the main platoon barracks. The message was clear: "You are here, but you are not one of us." The whispers followed her like the dust devils that spun across the base. "Army logistics geek. Looks like my mom's accountant. But she can't even do 5 pull-ups." The young Marines of 3rd Platoon, Fast Company Bravo, were a proud and insular tribe. They prided themselves on being the Corps' frontline responders, harder, faster, and more lethal than anyone else. An Army Sergeant Major, a woman, and a logistician being assigned as their advisor was a joke. The next morning, at 0450, Petrova was already outside the makeshift dojo, a wide, matted area surrounded by sandbags. She was stretching slow and deliberate movements that looked more like yoga than a pre-workout warm-up. The Marines began to trickle in, loud and boisterous, slapping each other on the back. They pointedly ignored her. Cortez arrived, shirtless, his torso a slab of conditioned muscle. He slammed a heavy bag with a few percussive kicks, each impact echoing like a gunshot. "All right, ladies, circle up," he barked. The platoon formed a loose circle. Petrova finished her stretch and stood at the edge, an observer. Today, we work ground fighting, Cortez announced, pacing the center of the mat. Ambassadors and politicians don't get attacked in an open field. It's tight spaces, hallways, elevators. You get taken to the ground, you need to be the one who gets back up. He demonstrated a series of aggressive grappling techniques, all power and explosive force. He chose Lance Corporal O'Malley, a lanky kid from Boston, as his partner, effortlessly throwing him to the mat and applying a chokehold until the boy frantically tapped out. The platoon cheered. Cortez got to his feet, breathing hard, sweat glistening on his skin. His eyes found Petrova, still standing silently at the edge. The moment was ripe. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Army do much of this? Or is it all just inventory forms and PowerPoint?" A few Marines snickered. Petrova's expression didn't change. "We have our own programs," she said simply. "Yeah, I bet," Cortez grinned, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Tell you what, why don't you come out here? Show us a thing or two. I'll even go easy on you." The invitation hung in the air, thick and heavy with challenge. It was a public test, a ritual humiliation in the making. Every Marine stopped what they were doing, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Captain Hayes, who had been observing from the side, took a step forward, a flicker of concern on his face. This was unprofessional, but he didn't intervene. He was curious to see how she would handle it. Petrova looked at Cortez, then at the eager, mocking faces of the platoon. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," she said. She walked to the center of the mat, her boots silent on the padded surface. She didn't remove her utility blouse or unblouse her boots. She simply stood there, waiting. The contrast was stark. Cortez, a coiled spring of bare-chested muscle and aggression. Petrova, a figure of quiet stillness, fully uniformed, looking like she was waiting for a bus. "Ready, old-timer?" Cortez sneered, dropping into a low fighting stance. "Ready?" she replied, her voice a calm murmur in the suddenly silent space. The dismissal was absolute. In the eyes of Staff Sergeant Cortez and his platoon, Sergeant Major Petrova was not a warrior. She was a relic, an administrative fossil sent by a bureaucracy that understood nothing of the realities of their world. Her presence was an insult to their identity as elite Marine infantrymen. Her quiet demeanor was mistaken for weakness, her age for frailty, her branch of service for irrelevance. Cortez's challenge was more than just a crude display of dominance. It was an attempt to surgically excise this foreign body from their cohesive unit. He didn't wait for a signal. He lunged, not with a wild haymaker, but with a trained, explosive jab aimed at her face. A rangefinder, designed to provoke a flinch and create an opening for a takedown. It was a textbook MCMAP opening. Petrova didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She moved less than 6 inches, a slight pivot of her hips and a subtle turn of her shoulder. Her left hand came up, not to block the punch, but to meet his extended arm at the wrist. Her fingers weren't tense. They were like water flowing around a rock. They wrapped around his wrist, her thumb finding the pressure point just above the bone. Simultaneously, her right hand cupped his elbow. For Cortez, it felt like hitting a ghost. One moment his fist was traveling toward a target. The next, his entire arm was caught in a circuit of unexpected force. He felt a sharp, electric jolt run from his wrist to his shoulder. Before he could process the sensation, Petrova used his own forward momentum against him. She didn't pull him or push him. She guided him. With a turn that was brutally fluid, she redirected his path. His feet, planted for a power strike, became tangled. His center of gravity, once projected forward, was now spiraling away from him. His own 220 pounds of muscle became a weapon turned against itself. He saw the mat rushing up to meet him, a confused grunt escaping his lips. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Petrova was still holding his wrist. She followed him down, her knee pressing lightly into the side of his ribs, her grip on his arm now a controlling lock. She wasn't applying pressure, not yet. She was just holding him. It was over. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Silence. The platoon stared, mouths agape. The snickers had died in their throats. They had expected a clumsy defense, a quick takedown, a triumphant Cortez standing over a winded old woman. They saw their platoon sergeant, their toughest fighter, pinned to the mat before he had even landed a blow. Cortez, his face a mask of shock and rage, tried to buck her off. He was immensely strong, and he put all his power into a single, explosive bridge of his hips. It was like trying to shrug off a mountain. Petrova's weight shifted, flowing with his movement, neutralizing it instantly. She applied a tiny amount of pressure to his wrist, and a fresh spike of white-hot pain shot up his arm. He gasped. "You can break a man's balance with less than an ounce of pressure, Staff Sergeant," Petrova said, her voice still a low, even murmur. It wasn't a taunt. It was a clinical observation. If his structure is compromised. She released him and stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse. She hadn't broken a sweat. She hadn't even been breathing hard. She looked at the stunned faces of the Marines. "Structure is everything," she said. "In a building, in a platoon, in a fight. You were all power, no structure." Cortez scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He just stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his own expression one of dawning astonishment. "That's enough, Staff Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice tight. "Hit the showers. Platoon, fall out." The Marines dispersed, but not with their usual raucous energy. They were quiet, casting furtive, confused glances back at Petrova, who was already walking away from the mats as if nothing had happened. The dismissal had cracked. Through the crack, something unsettling and unknown was beginning to seep through. The quiet logistician had just dismantled their best fighter without effort. The joke wasn't funny anymore. Later that day, the real crisis began. It came not in the form of an enemy attack, but as a final readiness evaluation in the FOB's state-of-the-art shoothouse. It was a sprawling, multi-story structure of concrete and steel, designed to replicate a besieged embassy. The evaluators were not the usual base personnel. Captain Hayes was informed that morning that a team from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGRU, would be playing the role of hostile forces. They were there to provide a more dynamic and challenging scenario. This news sent a jolt of nervous energy through the platoon. This wasn't just a drill anymore. It was a test against the best. Pride was on the line. "Listen up," Hayes barked, standing before his platoon as they geared up. They loaded their rifles with simunition rounds, paint-filled projectiles that stung on impact and left a bright, unforgiving mark of failure. "These guys are SEALs. They're going to be fast and they're going to be dirty. But we are Marines. We are systematic. We go by the book because the book works. We move fast, we use overwhelming force, and we communicate. Cortez, you have the first fire team. Davies, you're on point. Clear the ground floor, establish a foothold. Go!" Cortez, still smarting from the morning's humiliation, was eager to reassert his authority. "Hoorah! Let's go, devils! Move, move, move!" His team of 4 Marines stacked up on the main entrance. On Cortez's signal, they kicked the door and flooded in, shouting, "Marines, get down!" They moved exactly as they had been trained, a whirlwind of aggressive motion. They cleared the first 2 rooms with brutal efficiency, a textbook display of CQB. They were loud, fast, and confident. And then it all went wrong. As they pushed into the main lobby, a cavernous space with a mezzanine overlooking the floor, they were hit from 3 directions at once. Simunition rounds splattered against their helmets and vests from above and from concealed positions behind a reception desk and a cluster of decorative planters. The pop-pop-pop of the training rounds was deafening. "Contact front! Contact high!" Davies yelled, a streak of blue paint appearing on his goggles. Cortez laid down a volley of suppressive fire toward the mezzanine, but the hostiles were gone, melting back into the shadows. Push through. O'Malley, Chun. Right side. They tried to advance, but their movements were channeled by the open layout of the lobby. The SEALs were using the space against them, firing and moving from positions the Marines couldn't immediately identify. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, and the fast platoon had walked right into the kill zone. Within 30 seconds, all 4 members of Cortez's team were marked with multiple paint splatters. An evaluator with a clipboard and a stopwatch blew a whistle. Team 1 is down, the evaluator announced, his voice flat. Cortez slammed his fist against a wall, his rifle hanging limp. He was covered in blue paint. His textbook tactics, his aggression, his speed, it had all been useless. The SEALs had been patient, they had chosen their ground, and they had dissected his team with surgical precision. Hayes sent in the second team. They tried a different approach, using smoke grenades to cover their entry into the lobby. The smoke provided concealment, but it also blinded them. The SEALs, equipped with thermal optics, saw them perfectly. They were cut down just as quickly, this time from unseen positions within the smoke cloud. For the next hour, it was a bloodbath. Hayes grew increasingly frustrated, his orders becoming sharper, more desperate. He had his teams try a pincer movement, a slow and deliberate room-by-room clearing, even a mad, concentrated rush up the central staircase. Each attempt failed. The SEALs were always a step ahead. They were fluid, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless. They didn't play by the fast platoon's rulebook. They used hidden crawlspaces, fired through walls at predictable entry points, and set up overlapping fields of fire that turned every hallway into a death trap. The morale of the platoon cratered. The cocky bravado of the morning was gone, replaced by frustrated silence and the sting of repeated, embarrassing failure. The young Marines, so confident in their training, were being systematically humiliated. They were good at kicking down doors and overwhelming insurgents in a mud hut. They were not prepared for this level of thinking, three-dimensional warfare. Cortez, his face a thundercloud, stalked back to the staging area after his third failed attempt. "It's bullshit, sir," he seethed at Hayes. "They know the layout better than we do. They're cheating." "They're not cheating, Staff Sergeant, they're better," Hayes snapped back, his own composure fraying. He ran a hand over his crew cut, staring at the blueprints of the shoot house as if they held a magic solution. But the lines on the paper couldn't account for the dynamic, intelligent enemy inside. His doctrine was failing him. All the aggression and speed of the Marine Corps was just leading his men into a meat grinder. Throughout the entire ordeal, Sergeant Major Petrova stood near the entrance, just behind the main staging area. She hadn't said a word. She just watched. She watched the teams go in, listened to the cacophony of simulated gunfire, and watched them come out, heads bowed, covered in the paint of defeat. Her face was unreadable, her posture relaxed. She observed the flow of the battle, her eyes scanning the building's exterior, noting the window placements, the ventilation shafts, the lines of sight from one floor to another. She wasn't watching the Marines. She was reading the problem. Finally, after the fifth team was declared notionally Kia, Hayes threw his helmet onto a gear crate in disgust. The DevGru team leader, a lanky lieutenant commander with a wry smile, strolled out of the shoot house, pulling off his helmet. "Having a little trouble, Captain?" he asked, not unkindly. "Your boys are strong, but they're loud, and they all walk the same way." Hayes's jaw tightened. He was out of ideas. His platoon was beaten, and he knew it. His gaze fell upon Petrova, still standing in the shadows, her calm a stark contrast to the chaos and frustration around her. He had dismissed her, ignored her, and allowed his NCO to disrespect her. Now he was desperate. "Sergeant Major," Hayes said, his voice strained, "you've been quiet. You have any suggestions?" The entire platoon turned to look at her. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was a plea. They had exhausted their own knowledge. They had run headfirst into a wall and broken themselves against it. Now they were looking at the quiet logistician, the old woman from the army, as their last unthinkable hope. Petrova's gray eyes met Hayes's. She didn't offer a suggestion. She didn't give a speech. She simply straightened up from the wall she'd been leaning against. "Give me a fire team," she said, her voice cutting through the exhausted silence. "For men. Your choice. And give me 5 minutes to brief them." The air grew thick with a new kind of tension. Captain Hayes stared at her, a dozen objections dying on his lips. His training, his pride, his entire career path screamed at him that this was wrong. Giving command of a Marine fire team to an Army logistician in the middle of a critical evaluation was career suicide. But the alternative was to admit complete and utter defeat. He looked at the smirking DevGru officer, then back at Petrova's unervingly calm face. "Cortez," Hayes said, his voice barely a whisper. "Pick 3 men. You're with the sergeant major." Cortez's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. Him? Go in under her command? After this morning? It was the ultimate humiliation. But it was a direct order. He clenched his jaw, the muscle twitching in his cheek. He pointed a finger at Davies, Chan, and a stocky Marine named Garcia. "You 3. On me." Petrova led the 4 Marines away from the prying eyes of the other evaluators and the rest of the platoon. She didn't unroll a blueprint or draw a complex diagram in the dirt. She gathered them in a tight circle. "Forget everything you just did," she began, her voice low and direct, forcing them to lean in to hear. "You were loud. You were predictable. You announced your every move. We will be silent. We will be invisible. We move on my signal only. No verbal commands inside. Watch me. Watch each other. We are not 4 individuals. We are one organism. You do not fire unless I fire or unless you have a clean, guaranteed shot. Understood?" The Marines nodded, their expressions sullen and skeptical. Cortez looked like he was about to explode. "Staff Sergeant," Petrova said, her eyes locking onto his. "Your job is rear security and overwatch. Nothing else. You see a threat, you tap my shoulder. You do not engage on your own. Your aggression is a liability in here. Control it." It was a stunning rebuke, delivered with the dispassionate finality of a surgeon. She had just neutered the platoon's alpha male, relegating him to the simplest role in the team. Cortez's face went dark, but he bit back whatever retort was on his tongue and gave a curt, angry nod. "Good," Petrova said. She then looked at the building, not at the front door where every other team had entered, but up. Her gaze traced the line of a thick drainage pipe that ran up the side of the building to the roof, passing just below a second-story bathroom window. "That's our way in," she stated. Davies blinked. "Sergeant Major, that's a 2-story climb. With full kit." "Then you'd better get a good grip," Petrova replied without a hint of irony. She turned and began stripping off her own gear, her blouse, her body armor, her helmet. Underneath, she wore a simple black t-shirt. Her arms, now visible, were not the heavily muscled limbs of Cortez, but they were corded with a dense, wiry strength. A long, faded scar ran from her right elbow down to her wrist, a pale white line against her weathered skin. She kept her sidearm, a spare magazine, and a fighting knife. "Travel light," she said. "We're not fighting a war. We're hunting." The Marines, stunned, followed her lead, stripping down to a minimal combat load. Petrova then produced a small coil of thin, incredibly strong-looking rope from a pouch on her belt. With a quick, practiced motion, she tied a weighted knot at one end. She backed up, swung it twice, and sent it sailing upward. The weight snaked perfectly over a sturdy ventilation housing on the roof, 2 stories up. She pulled it taut, testing it with her full weight. It held. "Davies, you're first," she whispered. Silent. One by one, the Marines ascended the rope, their boots scraping softly against the concrete wall. They were strong men, and the climb was difficult but manageable. Cortez went last, his movements stiff with anger. Petrova followed him, climbing with a startling, spider-like grace, using her feet as much as her hands. She moved as if gravity were merely a suggestion. They gathered on the narrow ledge outside the bathroom window. Petrova produced a small, flat piece of steel from another pouch. A shim. She slid it into the seam of the window, jiggled it for a moment, and with a soft click, the lock disengaged. She slid the window open without a sound. She held up a hand, signaling a halt. She didn't look inside. She closed her eyes, listening. For 10 seconds, there was absolute stillness. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. Davies slipped through the window, then Chun, then Cortez. Petrova was the last one in. The bathroom was empty. They were on the second floor, behind the main positions the SEALs had used to dominate the lobby. Petrova pointed, directing Davies and Chun to cover the hallway door. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed at her ear, then down the hall. 2 hostiles, close. The Marines couldn't hear a thing, but they didn't question her. Petrova moved to the door, not beside it in the standard clearing stance, but flattened against the wall a few feet away. She didn't peek. She just waited. A full minute passed. Cortez was shifting his weight, impatient. Petrova shot him a look that could freeze fire. He froze. Then they heard it, the soft scuff of a boot, followed by low murmuring from the hallway. The SEALs were doing a sweep, assuming any new assault would come from the ground floor. Petrova held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. On 0, she didn't kick the door. She reached out and turned the knob, slowly, silently. She pulled the door inward, creating a narrow, 10-inch gap. Through the gap, she could see a section of the opposite wall. She raised her pistol. 2 SEALs passed the doorway, rifles at the ready, focused on the stairwell at the far end of the hall. They never thought to look behind them. As the second man's back crossed the gap, Petrova fired twice. Pop, pop. 2 quick, precise shots. The first SEAL whirled around, raising his rifle, but Chan and Davies were already leaning out, firing from the cover of the doorway. Pop, pop, pop. 3 SEALs down in 5 seconds. No shouting, no wasted motion, just quiet, lethal geometry. The evaluator's voice crackled over a hidden speaker. 2 hostiles down. 1 friendly hit. Chun had taken a single round to the shoulder plate, a glancing blow. Petrova didn't pause. She motioned for them to follow, moving down the hall. She didn't hug the walls or move in the jerky, robotic fashion of a standard CQB drill. She flowed down the center of the corridor, her steps silent, her eyes constantly scanning, not just forward, but up at the ceiling vents, down at the floor tiles, checking for tripwires or pressure plates. She was reading the building's subtle language. They reached the mezzanine overlooking the lobby where Cortez's first team had been annihilated. Petrova signaled a halt. She crawled on her belly to the edge, peering through the railing. Below, 2 more SEALs were repositioning, using the large planters for cover, their attention focused on the main entrance. They were waiting for the next frontal assault. Petrova looked back at her team. She pointed to herself, then to the SEAL on the left. She pointed to Davies, then the SEAL on the right. She pointed to Cortez and Chan and then pointed back the way they came, signaling for them to hold security. She held up 3 fingers. On 0, she and Davies leaned over the railing simultaneously. 2 more silenced pops echoed in the vast space. The 2 SEALs in the lobby crumpled, bright red paint splattering on the floor beside them. 2 hostiles down, the evaluator's voice announced, a note of surprise in it this time. Cortez stared, his mind struggling to keep up. This wasn't a frontal assault. This wasn't overwhelming force. This was an infiltration. This was sabotage. Petrova wasn't fighting them. She was hunting them. She had bypassed their strength and attacked their blind spots. They cleared the rest of the second floor with the same chilling efficiency. Petrova seemed to have a sixth sense for where the enemy would be. She'd pause before a doorway, holding up 1 or 2 fingers, and moments later, that exact number of hostiles would be engaged and neutralized. She used reflections in windows, the faint whisper of an air conditioning unit, the subtle change in airflow under a door. Tiny details the Marines had never been trained to notice. They reached the final room. The ambassador's office, the objective. It was a large, fortified room. The hostage was inside, along with the remaining 2 members of the SEAL team, including their lieutenant commander. A frontal breach was suicide. Petrova led her team past the door to an adjacent executive office. Inside, she pointed at the thick wall separating the two rooms. Then she pointed at Chen's gear. Chen carried a small breaching charge, intended for doors. "Too loud," Petrova whispered, the first words she'd spoken since entering. "Give me the det cord and the blasting cap. Davies, your knife." She took the thin strand of detonating cord and, using Davies's knife, carefully slit the drywall. She didn't cut a square. She traced a complex, jagged line like a spiderweb. She fed the det cord into the slit, taping it in place. It wasn't a breaching charge anymore. It was a surgical tool. "This wall is just drywall and steel studs," she murmured, her fingers working with practiced dexterity. "The sound will be sharp, but it won't be the boom of a C4 charge. It will disorient them. It buys us 1 second. No more." She placed the blasting cap, attached a remote detonator, and moved the team back. She looked at them, her eyes intense. "When it goes, we go. Davies, you're first. Flashbang. Chen, you're second. Cortez, you're on me. 1 second. Move." She pressed the button. There wasn't a huge explosion, but a deafening crack like lightning striking a tree. The section of wall she had traced blew inward, not as a solid piece, but as a shower of jagged plaster and dust. Before the dust had even settled, Davies hurled a flashbang through the new opening. The bang hiss of the grenade was followed by screams of surprise from inside. Petrova and her team poured through the gap. They didn't enter in a line. They fanned out, each Marine assigned a corner of the room before they had even entered. Petrova went low, her pistol tracking. She saw the DevGru lieutenant commander, eyes squeezed shut, shaking his head to clear it. He was bringing his rifle up on muscle memory alone. Petrova's pistol barked twice. 2 red paint spots appeared on his chest. At the same time, Davies and Chun engaged the final hostile, who was trying to use a desk for cover. Silence. The room was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. The hostage, a training dummy, sat untouched in a chair. All 8 hostiles were down. Petrova's team had suffered 1 minor hit. The evaluator's voice came over the speaker, flat and devoid of emotion. "Exercise complete. Hostiles neutralized. Hostage secure." For a long moment no one moved. Cortez stood in the center of the ruined office, his rifle lowered. He looked at the neutralized seals, at the jagged hole in the wall, and then at Sergeant Major Petrova. She was already reloading her pistol, her movements calm and economical, as if she had just finished a simple task like washing the dishes. The fury on his face had been replaced by a look of profound, earth-shattering confusion. Everything he knew, everything he had been taught about warfare, had just been turned inside out by a 50-year-old army logistician. The debrief was held in a sterile, air-conditioned conference room. Captain Hayes sat at one end of the table, the DevGru lieutenant commander at the other. The Marines of 3rd Platoon filled the chairs, silent and exhausted. Petrova sat slightly apart from the rest, her hands resting on the table, her expression neutral. The lieutenant commander, whose name was Miller, gave a frank assessment. "Captain, your men are strong. They're disciplined, and they follow orders. But they are predictable. Every team used the same entry point. Every team communicated on the same channels. Every team moved the same way. We knew what you were going to do before you did it. You were fighting the last war. We were fighting this 1 inch." He then put up the helmet cam footage from Petrova's run. The room was silent as they watched the silent, fluid infiltration. They saw the rope climb, the shimmed window, the patient ambush in the hallway. They saw the surgical use of the det cord, not as a sledgehammer but as a scalpel. The footage was fast, brutal, and almost balletic in its efficiency. It was unlike anything the Marines had ever seen. "This," Miller said, pointing to the screen, "was different. This wasn't a plan. This was an instinct. Whoever led this team doesn't just know the doctrine. They know the enemy. They know the environment. This is what we train our guys to do. The question is, Captain, who the hell is she?" He gestured with his chin toward Petrova. Every eye in the room fell on her. Captain Hayes felt a flush of shame. He had her file, of course, but he had only skimmed it, seeing Joint Special Operations Logistics Command and dismissing the rest. Now he felt like a fool. He cleared his throat. "Sergeant Major Petrova is our new senior enlisted advisor," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Logistics, huh? That must be some high-speed supply depot you came from, Sergeant Major." Petrova didn't smile. She simply met his gaze. "Something like that." The meeting ended. The Marines filed out, not with their usual swagger, but with a quiet, contemplative air. They avoided looking at Petrova, but their avoidance was born of awe, not dismissal. Cortez lingered behind, waiting until the room was nearly empty. He walked over to where Petrova was gathering her notes. He stood before her, a giant of a man humbled. He struggled for words, his pride warring with the undeniable truth of what he had witnessed. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice rough, "this morning on the mats, and in there," he gestured vaguely toward the shoot house, "I've never seen anything like it. What you did, how you moved, that's not in any book I've ever read. Some books aren't meant to be read by everyone, Staff Sergeant," Petrova said, her voice soft. Cortez nodded slowly, understanding that he was being given a glimpse into a world he didn't know existed. "That move," he said, "the one with the wrist, can you teach me that?" It was the highest form of praise he was capable of giving. It was an admission of superiority. Petrova looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the arrogance to the warrior beneath. She saw a man who, once humbled, was hungry to learn. "PT is at 0500, she said. "Be on the mats. We'll start with balance." Cortez just stood there for a moment, then gave the shortest, sharpest nod of his life. "Hoorah, Sergeant Major." He turned and walked out, his entire bearing different. The swagger was gone, replaced by the quiet purpose of a student. That night, Captain Hayes sat in his cramped office, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. He couldn't shake the events of the day. The ease with which Petrova had dismantled Cortez. The impossible, fluid grace of her tactics in the shoot house. Joint Special Operations Logistics Command was a lie. It had to be. He used his command-level access to do something he probably shouldn't have. He submitted a formal request for the unsealing of Sergeant Major Elena Petrova's full service record. His justification was mission-critical advisory role assessment. For a few minutes, the system denied him. Then, surprisingly, a notification pinged. Access granted. A single, heavily redacted file appeared on his screen. The file was thin, most of it blacked out. But what was visible was staggering. Her basic training, OCS, and early career were standard. Then, around 15 years ago, her record went dark. She was transferred to a unit that was designated only as U.S. Army Special Operations Command, Augmentation Detachment 11. Hayes had never heard of it. It was a ghost unit. Her list of completed training courses scrolled on for pages. SEER School, High Risk, multiple advanced sniper courses, unconventional warfare, counterterrorism driving, instructor certifications in Krav Maga, Systema, and a half-dozen other lethal fighting styles he didn't even recognize. Languages: Russian, Pashto, Arabic, Farsi, all fluent. Then he found the operational history. It was almost entirely redacted, just a list of dates and locations. Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, Chechnya, Syria, Yemen, places she had no official reason to be. The mission descriptions were just single words: neutralization, extraction, infiltration. Finally, at the bottom of the summary page, he found what he was looking for. A single line of text next to the heading, Operational Callsign, Kikamora. Hayes stared at the word. He didn't know what it meant. He typed it into a search engine. The result came back almost instantly. Kikimora. In Slavic folklore, a legendary creature, a female house spirit, sometimes a helpful domestic spirit, but more often described as a malevolent, unseen entity that would enter a house at night through the keyhole, impossible to see, impossible to stop. He leaned back in his chair, the breath leaving his lungs in a slow hiss. She wasn't a logistician. She wasn't a supply clerk. She was a ghost. She was one of the quiet, terrifyingly competent women who operated in the deepest shadows of the special operations world. The ones whose names were never spoken and whose missions were never acknowledged. And the army, in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, had sent her here to advise his fast platoon. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. They hadn't sent him an advisor. They had sent him a legend. The next morning, the platoon was formed up for PT at 0500. The atmosphere was transformed. The usual loud jokes and backslapping were gone, replaced by a quiet, professional readiness. When Petrova walked onto the training field, the conversation stopped. Every Marine straightened up. Cortez was already on the mats, stretching, just as she had done the day before. He looked up as she approached. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice clear and respectful. Petrova nodded. "Staff Sergeant." As she walked past the formation, Captain Hayes stepped forward. He called the platoon to attention. "Sergeant Major on deck," he barked. The call was unnecessary, a formality usually reserved for high-ranking officers, but the message was unmistakable. It was a public declaration of respect. Petrova stopped, her expression unchanging, and waited as the platoon snapped to rigid attention. Hayes walked up to her, stopping a respectful distance away. He didn't apologize for his previous skepticism. A good officer didn't make excuses. He corrected his mistakes. "Sergeant Major," Hayes said, his voice firm, "your advisory role is at your discretion. We would be honored to learn anything you are willing to teach us. The platoon is yours." Petrova held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, accepting nod. The dismissal was over. The respect had been earned, not with words or with rank, but with undeniable, inescapable competence. She had broken them down, shown them their weaknesses, and then provided the example they needed to rebuild. The sun had not yet risen. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the first hint of dawn a faint line of orange on the eastern horizon. The FOB was still, caught in the quiet moments between the last watch of the night and the first stirrings of the day. Long after the platoon had been dismissed to their duties, Elena Petrova was alone in the empty dojo. The sandbag walls absorbed all sound, creating a pocket of profound silence. She wasn't cleaning a weapon or performing maintenance on her gear. She stood in the center of the mats, her boots planted, her eyes closed. Her hands, held loosely at her sides, began to move. It wasn't a practice of forms, not a kata or a drill. It was slower, more meditative. Her fingers traced patterns in the air. Her arms flowed in circular motions, her body turning with an impossible smoothness. It was the physical language of a lifetime spent in the shadows. Each movement was a memory, a parry that deflected a knife in a crowded bazaar in Marrakesh. A subtle shift of weight that avoided a sentry's grasp on a snowy night outside Grozny. A precise, economical strike taught to her by a forgotten master in a forgotten war. Her body was a library of violence, and in the stillness of the dawn, she was reading from its oldest, most silent volumes. The scars on her arms seemed to catch the faint, pre-dawn light. They were not trophies of victory, but marks of survival, receipts for lessons paid for in blood and pain. She moved without anger or aggression. It was a centering, a quiet recalibration of the self, a way to hold the deadly knowledge she possessed without letting it consume her. She was the Kikimora, the unseen spirit, but she was also Elena Petrova, a sergeant major with a job to do. As the first true rays of sunlight crested the horizon and spilled over the walls of the FOB, painting the dusty ground in shades of gold and rose, she stopped. She stood perfectly still for a full minute, facing the rising sun, her face unreadable. She was not a hero. She was not a monster. She was a professional. Then, with the same quiet economy of motion she applied to everything, she turned and walked off the mats. The sun was up. The day's work was beginning. There was a platoon of young Marines who needed to learn how to be quiet, how to be invisible, how to see the world not as a nail to be hammered, but as a lock to be picked. And she was there to teach them. The respect she had earned was not a prize. It was simply a tool, the key she now held to open their minds.